The teaching of languages has a long tradition at the University of Virginia. In 1824, Thomas Jefferson looked towards Europe for the first cadre of professors to teach at the university. And the academical village became the home of George Long, who came from Cambridge, England, to teach Latin and Greek. And George Blatterman, a German-born but British-trained professor of French, Spanish, Italian, German, Anglo-Saxon, Danish, Swedish, Portuguese, and Hollandish, as the university's catalog boasted. You think the university got a really good deal hiring this guy. Unfortunately, the man never learned to use words to express displeasure or anger, so he had to leave fairly quickly. Today, the university's linguistic compass points at all directions, with growing enrollments in Chinese, Arabic, Spanish, and courses taught in 22 different languages, including American Sign Language, Persian, Hindi, Urdu, Yiddish, Japanese, Korean, Italian, Hebrew, and Sanskrit, as well as many other strategic and less commonly taught languages. In an academic environment that is ever more global and interconnected, language instruction cannot remain an activity intramuros, limited to the four walls of individual departments, often struggling to meet increasing enrollment demands for popular languages, or frustrated with having to measure the subtle riches of linguistic proficiency by the narrow stick of the number of enrolled students and courses taught. With the Institute of World Languages, we want to provide bridges among our solid departmental homes. Increasing partnership and connections mean enhancing visibility and furthering access to ideas as well as resources. Stated by the IWL Steering Committee, the mission of the Institute is, and I quote, to bring world languages to the forefront of our educational mission. Today, we are here to begin to make this ambitious plan a reality. I would like to take the opportunity now to thank all the colleagues who served on the IWL Steering Committee for the inspired work for the past 2 years, and also to extend a special sign of gratitude to Miao Fenseng, who in the Department of East Asian Language, Literatures and Cultures, for her impressive assistance in making this symposium a reality. I like to think of the IWL as a capacious and comfortable place, a piazza or a salotto, where colleagues promote the sharing of expertise and the dissemination of knowledge, and contribute to a whole that is respectful of its parts, but is also more nuanced than those individual parts. I see this piazza attracting technologists and pedagogues, applied linguists and philosophers of language, experts in second language acquisition, and literature, culture scholars. The IWL journey across departments, disciplines, and languages starts today. Here I see many piazzas, both virtual and real, that will be the gathering places, our intellectual agoras. I see many encounters at crossroads with new roadmaps to share, novel partners to greet, and initiatives to embark upon. In what I am sure is an auspicious beginning, this morning we are here to greet and gather inspiration from two experienced fellow travelers, Michael Geisler and Scott McGuinness. Michael Geisler is Vice President for the Middlebury College Language Schools, Schools Abroad, graduate programs, as well as Professor of German. His impressive CV is way too long for me to go through here, and I don't want to steal time away from his presentation, but you have it in your handouts. His focus in the strategic importance of foreign languages and area studies in the age of globalization. Michael has overseen the establishment of 16 Middlebury schools abroad, including in the Middle East, as well as France, Chile, Spain, Brazil, China, Japan, and more recently, Cameroon and India. Michael will be our first speaker today, and the title of his keynote address is Nation as Networks, Foreign Language Study in the Post-Davos Age. Please welcome Michael Geisler.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Associate Dean Christina de la Collette and, of course, Mia Feng Zen and also Dean Wu for inviting us. I'd like my co-conspirator to thank my co-conspirator, Scott McGuinness, for doing so many of these post-MLA report talks. As some of you may know, we are among the perpetrators of that 2007 report that still gets bandied about. By the way, if I might say that, there are still rooms in the front, and I'm a very friendly person, so if you want to come and sit somewhere, please come and sit. You don't have to stand. As we're trying to get up the PowerPoint presentation, and I think it's up, what I want to talk to you about today is I want to talk about the state of foreign language education in the United States, where I think it might be headed, and what I think we can do about maybe turning it into a slightly different direction and meeting the needs of the government and businesses in ways that we so far have not met these needs before. To do that, let me go back to, and I'll see if this works, yes, to the post 9/11 moment that I found particularly interesting. Right after the 9/11 disaster happened, there was a 60 Minutes episode. Mike Wallace, who was still alive then and one of the most important senior reporters for 60 Minutes, did an interview with the heads of the intelligence agencies around the nation. Some of you may have seen that. And somewhere during the interview, he turned to them and he said, very bluntly, as was his traditional style, "How's your Arabic?" And they said, well, I can speak Russian, several of them said. One of them was fluent in Vietnamese, but no one had any background in Arabic. Now that has to do a lot with what we were looking at the time. It has to do with the fact that the critical language at that time was Russian still, and I think it was a slightly unfair question. It wasn't fair to put it to them, although in a sense it was emblematic of the problem that we had. In the wake of the 9/11 attack, and you know that Arabic has been pushed like crazy at the Middlebury Summer Language Schools, Arabic is actually outpacing Chinese, which is amazing given the number of jobs that there are in Chinese. I'm not unhappy about the fact that so many people are learning Arabic, but they should also be learning Chinese. But that is sort of the way that we tend to go about promoting languages. And a lot of that has to do with, my apologies to my good friend Scott, with the way that the DoD, the Department of Defense, often is the driver of language policy in this country. That has its good sides because they provide money and incentives, and there is a trickle-down effect, such as the flagship, so I'm very grateful for that. Even though we don't run a flagship at Middlebury, we had a flag dinghy for a while, but we don't have a flagship. It's important that the Department of Defense or the Department of State set these kinds of initiatives, but they also have downstream effects that are not always the desired effects, and that's mostly what I want to focus on. I'm not going to read this quote. I try not to read my things unless I want to make a point about that. So you can actually read that, but this is one of the many statements that came out soon after 9/11 that pointed out that we really, really need to study Arabic, and we really need to study some of the critical languages as the Defense Department saw it at that time. This kind of policy was solidified or emblematized, you might say, in an article that Dick Brecht and William Rivers wrote for the Monterey Institute of Technology publication that came out in 2002, where they talked about a change in US policy as they wanted it from a universal language education policy that would push all languages simultaneously to a selective policy where we would pick certain critical languages and push those and sort of hope that somehow the other languages would take care of itself. And that is the disastrous part of the post 9/11 piece. It's nice that we are pushing certain languages. It is, I think, very problematic if we do that to the extent of excluding other languages. And this is mostly what I want to talk about today. So this is the a critical languages approach to competitiveness in a world economy. You turn to critical languages when you are a touchdown behind, you're on 4th down, you have 30 seconds to go, and your quarterback has just been sacked. That's when you reach for the critical languages approach. Okay, and you can figure out which team I favor in football. And I'll come back to sports later because I think they're an important part of what we do. I call this the critical language du jour approach. Today it's Arabic, before that, and it's still Chinese, but as you go through that, this is a rough and tumble. Please don't be very specific on that. I haven't done a lot of research on the exact dates, but roughly I think the dates are about right. You could add the 1980s to Japanese, but if you look at the past 60 years or so, we've always had these critical languages and we've always promoted them, and we've left the other languages in the dust, and that is the reason why we are in the kind of desperate state that we are in. Because the critical language du jour means that another critical language doesn't get, or the critical language of tomorrow doesn't get the attention it needs today, and that's the problem with this approach. So what I would promote instead is that we think about a strategic language reserve, where we have the 10 or 20 most important world languages on tap at all times. And I was actually very happy to hear that there are a very large number of languages taught here at UVA. So you're doing what we are hoping that more institutions will do in the future. The critical piece of that is they should be taught all the time. Now, if I may put in one plug for Middlebury, we've been doing this for nearly 100 years. There are some faculty who have taught with Middlebury in the summer. We are very happy that we can get qualified faculty to teach at the Middlebury Summer Language Schools in the summer. But the critical piece of what we're doing is that whenever we have introduced a language, with one exception, whenever we've introduced a language, we have continued to teach it year after year after year for nearly 100 years. The only exception is German, the original language actually, which in 1917 was canceled for a short time period, and you can imagine why if you know history. But other than that, we have never canceled a language. So when you come to Middlebury, you know that the languages will always be taught. And I hope that the same thing is true for your very rich array of languages here at UVA, that you can assume that when you take a language today, 20 years from now, somebody can come back and take the same language. That, to me, is the litmus test of a really successful language policy. So a strategic language reserve, to me, is the opposite of the critical language approach, the critical language du jour approach. It provides a sustainable pipeline for world languages. It provides broad-based access. It doesn't have to be universal, and I'll talk about that a little later if we have a moment. It should provide students with transnational expertise, with at least one additional region than their own, obviously, and it should be open to lifelong learning. So what does this mean for the future of foreign language education in the US, and where are we today? Let's go back to this famous statement by Senator Paul Simon that he made in 1987. 1987, the year is important here. 200,000 Americans miss out on job opportunities because they do not know foreign languages. This was 1987. This is a selective list of events and effects of globalization since 1987. So you have the fall of the Berlin Wall, you have the introduction of the euro, the European Union expansion, international terrorism. That goes back to 1972 or 1967, depending on how you count. But it became a major force of globalization since in the 1990s, and obviously since 2001. The internet, just-in-time delivery, the North Atlantic Free Trade Association, the rise of the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, global warming, international environmental initiatives, international risk management, China and Singapore rising, the Arab Spring, and of course, the influence that YouTube and Twitter and other technologies have on the way people communicate with each other across regional divides. That is globalization since then. So, with that as the challenge, my question would be, are we getting it? Maybe. Some of you may have heard Secretary Arne Duncan's remarks at the Foreign Language Summit, where he said very clearly one place we obviously need to get better is in teaching languages. The United States is a long way from being the multilingual society that so many of our economic competitors are. You know that we hover around 20% of people who can speak a second language. The European Union countries are around the 50% mark as we speak right now, and probably going up further. This is a high-stakes issue. For too long, Americans have relied on other countries to speak our language, but we won't be able to do that in the increasingly complex and interconnected world. To prosper economically and to improve relations with other countries, Americans need to read, speak, and understand other languages. Schools, colleges, and universities must include producing bilingual students as a central part of their mission. Just last year, the Council on Foreign Relations published the Independent Task Force Report number 68, the result of an advisory committee co-chaired by Joel Klein and Condoleezza Rice. You can actually order that if you want to take a look at it. I recommend reading the whole publication. It's well worth it. But again, it came out very clearly in saying the United States is not producing enough foreign language speakers to staff important posts in the US Foreign Service, the intelligence community, and American companies. For the first time here that I can remember, other than individual brochures or books written by individual business people, they mention specifically the business need, and this is where our window of opportunity is if we take it. A failure to learn about global cultures has serious consequences. A recent report by the US Army Research Institute for the Behavioral and Social Sciences asserted that cultural learning and cultural agility are critical skills in the military. The military, the DoD, understands that just speaking the language on a rudimentary level isn't enough. You actually have to interact with these people and understand a little bit about their culture. That's also a major turnaround. The new flagship initiatives are helping to push that. So that's a big step in the right direction, and I thank Scott McGuinness and his colleagues for pushing that on the agenda. This is also important. They said the task force does not argue that all US children should begin studying strategic languages and cultures. However, the opportunity to learn these languages and about the people who speak them should be available to many students across the United States, and all students should have access to high-quality foreign language programs starting in the earliest grades. So they urge governors to make sure that this happens on the local and regional level. Another encouraging development is the growth of linguistics minors and majors on the undergraduate level. Linguistics has always been around, but many colleges and universities have introduced linguistics on the undergraduate level. That means people who take these courses, and interestingly enough, many students, as we found at Middlebury when we introduced our own linguistics program on the undergraduate level a couple of years ago, many students are actually fascinated by language. They are fascinated by linguistics. Once they take linguistics courses, many of them wind up in foreign language courses, even if they haven't done so before. So linguistics is actually one conduit, if it's done right, towards greater interest in foreign languages. So maybe we are getting it, or maybe not. This is something that came out only last year, and please note the source. This is Forbes. Forbes is one of the quintessential business publications. Business people read this. This is a sign of the growing interest among the business community in foreign language skills. They are now pushing this issue. And we have to talk about later, maybe in the Q&A, what kind of form this will take. So they wrote, we should care a lot about our foreign language deficit. We need diplomats, intelligence and foreign policy experts, politicians, military leaders, business leaders, scientists, physicians, entrepreneurs, managers, technicians, historians, artists, and writers who are proficient in languages other than English. At the same time, the percentage of public and private elementary schools offering foreign language instruction decreased from 31 to 25%. You know these numbers, they are all bad, okay? The percentage of all middle schools offering foreign language instruction decreased from 75 to 58%. The percentage of high schools offering some foreign language courses remained about the same at 91%. Yesterday, the job information list of the MLA came out, the new report, rather, came out on the job information list, and last year we were up a little, 3-point-some% compared to the year before, but still some 30% below the high of 20 years ago. This year we are down again 2.3%. So again, we are losing positions in foreign languages, and it's a disaster. I won't quote that in detail, but again, this is more of the same. We are still losing important parts of foreign language instruction in the country. And then, of course, there are the gurus of globalization that we don't need, and I'll be very frank about that. You know who this is. I will just give you the quote. This is from an article Larry Summers wrote in the New York Times, What You Really Need to Know, where he prognosticated about what kind of skills students would have to have for the next decade or two. And he said, English's emergence as the global language, along with the rapid progress in machine translation, you should try that if you haven't, and the fragmentation of languages spoken around the world make it less clear that the substantial investment necessary to speak a foreign tongue is universally worthwhile. While there's no gainsaying the insights that come from mastering a language, it will over time become less essential in doing business in Asia, treating patients in Africa, or helping resolve conflicts in the Middle East. This does not help. I thought that kind of attitude went out with John Foster Dulles, but apparently it hasn't. We do need foreign languages, and I'll give you one specific example. I talked to a Middlebury alum who is a VP in a leading position of a very well positioned on the world market, a German automobile manufacturer. You will all have heard its name, but I'm not going to give that to you right now. We had dinner together, and he talked to me about his background, and he's fluent in Spanish, he's fluent in German. And he said, you know, Michael, I am here because I speak German. And I smiled, and I said, that's very nice of you. I know we like each other, and I know you're a good alum to Middlebury, but come on, you have a few other qualities. And he smiled back, and he said, yes, I do. But so did 12 other American expats, all leading business people who came with me to Germany when I came here, and not one of whom spoke the language. I am the only one left. All the others are gone because they did not speak German. I said, okay, so we all know that Germans speak English, and he said, yes, they do. In the boardrooms, they speak English. In public meetings, they speak English. And what do they do after the board meeting is over? What do Germans do after the board meeting is over? They head to the Kneipe, to the pub, right? And guess where the networking happens? It is not in the boardroom. It's in the pub. And in the pub, Germans, like the French or the Italians or the Chinese, wherever they go after a board meeting, don't like to speak English because it is not their first language. Even if they speak it well, they want to go back to German. And so if you want to network, which is a critical piece for advanced leadership positions, you have to do it in the language. So, what can we do? Not this. That's not a good recipe for success. But maybe something along these lines. And now it gets a little complicated because I want to talk about a few specifics here. I looked at social network analysis for a research project that I will pursue one of these days when I'm no longer a full-time administrator. And I found it quite fascinating that what sociologists do who do social network analysis, and I'm not saying we should all become sociologists, and I'm not even saying we should all do social network analysis, although there might be some very interesting projects for foreign language researchers along these lines. I'm just very interested in how they look at the world, and I recognize that this is very much how I look at the world as a foreign language researcher. Propinquity, physical closeness, is one of their critical pieces. In network analysis, they talk about the fact that people who live relatively close to each other tend to share similar values, attitudes, mindsets, approaches to solving certain problems, and even social status. Propinquity creates a constant feedback loop wherein these similarities are mutually reinforced so that even innovation and change to the system is introduced along prioritized pathways which privilege some types of new information over others. In plain English, this means you talk to your friends, you talk to your families, you talk to your colleagues, and how you talk to them has something to do with how new information gets filtered down to your level. We know that from other sociological studies that the kind of information you get from a colleague or a friend tends to get privileged over information you might just read in a newspaper, and reinforces that or does not reinforce that. Because we are basically tribal, our anthropological development has not kept up with our technological development. We still think in terms of a tribal village when we interact with others, and I'll come back to that. Now, interestingly enough, they make this leap, which I think is critical to what we do. They say, this concept applies not only to individual people, but, and I quote, to all levels of networks, including groups, organizations, and even nations. So nations are networks based on the principle of propinquity. They are trying to actually approximate in the way that they position information vis-à-vis others, the kind of close interactions we have with friends and family members. With your friends and family members, you have strong ties. Obviously, I don't need to explain that to you, at least most of us. Some of us have dysfunctional families, and the ties might not be so strong. But under the best of circumstances, our friends and our families are our strong ties. They are the ones we go to when we want guidance, when we want to evaluate information. We need that network, right? So that is the model that we have in our minds. However, you also need weak ties. Weak ties are the kind of conversation you're having with me right now. I'm a weak tie, very weak tie, actually. People you might know that are remote from you, either geographically or in terms of the relationship you have with them, or both. But people, nevertheless, with whom you have or have had some kind of interaction. The critical piece of this is that you can have weak ties directly, or you can have weak ties through a number of your friends. Organizations and nations survive by trying to persuade us that weak ties are actually strong ties. And this is how they do it. You've all heard, often in an ironic sense, because people catch on to that, companies refer to themselves as a family. My wife, who is a nurse, who is having some issues with her Porter Hospital at Middlebury background right now, complains about the fact that whenever there's a problem, they talk about Porter Hospital as a family. Universities do that too. We are guilty of the same thing. Okay? We are trying to present ourselves as a strong tie connection when it's actually a weak tie connection. Mark Anthony's famous speech, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears, is actually a perfect example of how you try to turn weak ties into strong ties. Okay? You position the nation as a bunch of friends. Fraternities, sororities with their national networks function the same way when you think about it. When in the New York Times we talked about spying on friendly countries, that's a perfect example. What's a friendly country? I'm sorry, I mean, many Germans love many people in the United States, but Germany as a country, because this was about the fact that the NSA spied on Chancellor Angela Merkel's emails and telephone calls. Germany as a country is not a friendly country. It's an ally, to be sure, and a strong ally, but countries are not friendly. They are not friends. But that's what we are trying to do. When we're talking about town meetings, the president has a town meeting, right? That's an attempt to translate a weak tie into a strong tie. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, for those of you who are old enough to remember that, same idea. On German television, the two longest running series is Tatort, which is actually, which made it to the United States as CSI, but has a particular role in Germany in tying in various regions into the national discourse in Germany. And Lindenstraße is a typical street in a typical town in Germany that for, I don't know what, 25 years or so, people have been watching day in and day out. It's the longest running soap opera on German television. All of that is an attempt to position the nation as a bunch of neighbors that are bound by the principle of propinquity. That's how you turn weak ties into strong ties. Other things that power the transformation of weak ties into strong ties are symbols, national symbols, traditions, typically invented traditions. You know, if you've studied traditions, that most of them have been invented somewhere between the 18th century and the 21st century. Education, food, big deal about food there. Social practices, architecture and design, laws, media. Foucault calls it a dispositif, which is translated into English as apparatus. I like the dispositif idea. I think the apparatus translation is not perfect, but I defer to my far more experienced colleagues in French on that, so that's why I'm using it with a little bit of caution. And all of these pieces that tie together weak ties and strong ties, or that transform weak ties into strong ties, are basically supported by language. They're not possible without language. Language is the critical piece that binds all of this together, that forms the nation. Weak ties are very, very important because, as Kadushin says, weak ties facilitate the flow of information from otherwise distant parts of the network. Individuals with few weak ties will be deprived of information from distant parts of the social system and will be confined to the provincial news and views of their close friends. So in a global society, the weak ties that are bounded by the nation are a critical piece of how information from the whole world gets processed. On the national level, propinquity and strong ties provide two powerful filters through which innovation is processed, both from within the system, that is new legislation, organizational, structural change, and from outside. Transnational issues, for instance, such as migration, global climate change, outsourcing of production lines, or resource issues. And this is why Davos failed. And I'll talk more about Davos in a moment. It's not a small world after all. You know the Milgram experiment, the small world, where he was trying to find out whether how many stations it would need for every single person in the United States to be connected to every other person in the United States, at least theoretically. Well, it turns out to be 6. That's the famous 6 degrees of separation that I'm sure all of you have heard about. Okay, that goes back to the Milgram experiment, actually. So here's the problem. If the small world hypothesis has any validity, then in principle, the entire world is connected as a network. Great. That's what globalization people like Larry Summers think. We're all connected. Okay, forget the nation. Sociologists say, true enough, but not practical. We cannot really understand social networks by looking at the entire world. Nations, communities, organizations, classrooms, even if connected with one another, have boundaries. These boundaries are incredibly important. These boundaries determine how we process the information that comes to us from the global network. It is filtered through the culture. It is filtered through the global, through the national boundaries. The weak ties, strong ties transformation that I talked about. There are all kinds of reasons for that I can't get into because I don't have the time, but this is very, very interesting to think about if you want to understand why nations and national cultures matter and why language matters in that connection. So I want to get back to the Daniel Yankelevich piece, which prompted many of us to think about the MLA report. He says, and this was published in 2005, with each passing year it grows more obvious that colleges must prepare Americans to deal more competently with people from other parts of the globe. It's not that educated Americans must become cultural experts. That is neither practical nor desirable. Experts cannot meet the threat. Okay, and this is very important to keep in mind. Experts cannot meet the threat. You need experts, but experts are not enough. So are we meeting the needs of students expected to operate in a global context? This is another quote from the MLA report. We found out that at the time, at least, this may have changed slightly, but probably, if anything, for the worse. 6.1% of college graduates whose first major is a foreign language go on to attain a doctoral degree in foreign languages. So what do we do with the remaining 93.9%? Right now, we're not serving them very well. They are interested in foreign languages. They are interested in foreign cultures. They are just not necessarily interested in a traditional literature curriculum. When I came to Middlebury, and I can say this because it's my own institution, I was hired to make this change. When I came to Middlebury, after you took the beginning language sequence, you took Novella 1, Novella 2, Novella 3. Novella is a particular German, well, I mean, it's not just German, but the Germans think of it as a particularly German. It actually comes from Italy. But Germans think of it as a German literary art form, and we required students to take 3 courses in this particular genre. This was in 1990. The number of discussions you can have with educated speakers of German, native speakers of German in Germany about the novella as a literary genre is strictly limited. And I suspect that's true of some other languages as well. That does not mean that students are not fascinated by the culture of the language they are studying. They just don't want to go into a very, very constrained curriculum. So, how do we do it? How do we deal with this? The Gazprom approach. That's what we do. The customer is always wrong. We know what's good for you. If 2 turns out to be wrong, then 1 applies. And if all fails, whine, ideally to your dean, about how we're not representing the interests of foreign languages enough. Right now, we are training specialists in foreign literature, specialists in literary theory, specialists in film studies, specialists in applied linguistics, and graduates with advanced foreign language skills. But are these the job skills needed by tomorrow's jobs, by tomorrow's companies and tomorrow's job seekers? We need all levels. We need specialists. We absolutely need specialists. The DoD needs specialists. Some companies need some specialists. But we can't just train specialists with the native speaker ideal in mind. We also need people who are very conversant with a language and can hold their own in education with a native speaker of that language. And we need multilingual people like Dean Wu, actually, who have had exposure to various different languages, even if they don't really speak them. That still helps to understand how other cultures construct the world. I'm going to skip this because I'm running out of time. We should ask ourselves whether we as foreign language teachers actually model the learning goals we are setting for our students. Do we actually understand the culture whose language we teach as much as we want our students to understand it? If we are not native speakers of American English, if we're not from the United States, do we understand the United States in the same way that we expect our students to understand Spanish culture, or Argentinian culture, or French culture, or Italian or Arabic culture? We can't teach these skills if we don't model them. If you look at the BA degrees in foreign languages and in the humanities, they're going down, down, down. But, and this is an interesting article I read in the MLA Profession in 2009, area studies, ethnic, cultural, and gender studies are up 206%. Liberal arts and sciences, general studies, and humanities are up 500%. Multi and interdisciplinary studies are up 404%. People are interested in other cultures, okay? When freed of the labels English literature or foreign language, the humanities and the liberal arts have been very popular with undergraduates. They've grown between 4 and 10 times more rapidly than bachelor's degree granting overall. So what do humanities students want? They want Starbucks lattes. I have a daughter who's studying in New York City, I know this. They want Starbucks lattes, they want iPhone 5, and they want tickets for a group called Panic. I'm not sure why you want tickets for Panic, but my daughter explained this to me. Seriously, what the humanities students really want? They want connections, not disciplines. And that's what humanities provides better than any other discipline, but we're not doing it. They want interdisciplinary and global studies. They want project-based, engaged experiential learning, and they want tools. The traditional model in which languages have tried to meet this demand is through international studies. So we have European studies, African studies, Middle Eastern studies, Russian and Eastern European studies, Asian studies, etc., etc. The pro of this is there are natural connections between these interests and language, literature, and culture. Problem number one, for Spanish and Arabic, where do they fit? Okay, I'm sure anyone who's teaching in the Spanish department is keenly aware of that problem. Problem number two, where is North America in this? Very often international studies excludes North America. It's ridiculous to talk about the world without talking about North America, right? It's a fairly significant part of the world. So that needs to be part of it. Problem number three, are these issues local issues that can be studied by only studying Western European culture or Northern European culture or even Middle Eastern culture, or are they cross-regional? And problem number four, who owns the field? Is it foreign languages? Is it international relations? That's often the case. Political science and economics. If you don't have an interdisciplinary program, you really don't have an international program. At Middlebury and many other institutions, we are moving towards a more global studies program where we're focusing on issues like security, risk, resources, environment, traditions and conventions, religion, communications, and we are starting with food studies, because for some reason people are really into food studies these days. I think food comes from the supermarket, but I have great admiration for people who actually tackle this problem, because quite seriously, I think it's a very serious problem. The pros are a big umbrella, it reflects the empirical reality, and it's a process, it's not a static content, which is the way that many language courses are taught right now. We run the risk of losing local expertise in this, and of course many of these programs tend to be taught in English. The good news is that the business community has started to take note of this. And I want to close by playing you an interview with Adrian Wooldridge. This is an article he actually published that I've used a lot, where he talks about the end of Davos man. This is his article. That's where I took my central metaphor from today. People whose jobs require constant whizzing through airports often overestimate the extent of globalization. Most other folk live in the same country all their lives. Most trade occurs within national borders. Nearly all politics is local. Company bosses who fail to notice this may underestimate political risks or ignore cultural differences, and such errors may prove disastrous. The best global leaders need to immerse themselves in local cultures, and then he gives some examples of that. Let me give you just one example of how we need to think about this. In the United States, if I were to teach people from Europe to understand how business is done in the United States, I would say the first thing you have to study is competitive athletics. You do not get US American culture, and I'm quite serious about this. This has nothing to do with high C and low C. I'm in a VP group of 10 people where this gets bandied about all the time. I actually had to go and study baseball and football to be able to participate in this group. You don't understand US America if you do not understand competitive athletics. It's one of the key metaphors of this country. Just one example, when President Obama, soon after the military takeover in Egypt, decided to withhold the delivery of 4 F-16s to Egypt, a spokesperson for the Pentagon said that this was an inside fastball to the generals. I pity the poor specialist in America, in Egypt at the time, who had to translate for the generals what this actually meant. You don't get American culture if you don't get American sports. This is not true to the same degree of all other cultures. It's true of some, but not nearly as strong as it is here. This is an interview with Adrian Wooldridge, who, by the way, is the business editor of The Economist.
In London, this is The Economist. In this week's issue, we have our Business Books Quarterly, and one of the books that we're reviewing is called Fish Can't See Water, How National Cultures Can Make or Break Your Corporate Strategy by Kai Hammerich and Richard Lewis. With me to discuss this is Adrian Wooldridge, who is our management editor and writes our Schumpeter column. So first of all, Adrian, we've had multinationals for an awful long time now. Go back to the East India Company, all the way through the sort of, the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s and so on. And you have people out there saying that the world is flat these days because of globalization, the spread of the internet, international culture and so on. Does this still matter really for businesses?
Oh, I think it matters a great deal. I think that there has been a fashion recently, partly because of Tom Friedman's book, The World is Flat, to think that culture doesn't matter, that we're all basically the same. Everybody washes their hair with the same shampoo, everybody wants to drive a similar car, everybody has the same basic needs.
All right, I'm not going to play it out. Basically, he talks about the fact that businesses need business leaders who understand local cultures. And he cites the Walmart example in Germany. And he actually says in this interview, and by the way, the CEO of Walmart who tried this disastrous attempt to bring Walmart to Germany, which was completely localized in completely the wrong way. Germans completely rejected it. And he says, by the way, he didn't even speak German. What is happening is that for the first time, the business community is listening to us. We need to listen to the business community and ask them, what are the skills you actually need? And it is not Novella 1, Novella 2, and Novella 3. But we have the skills as foreign language departments to meet both the linguistic and cultural needs, not only of the defense community, but of the business community and of an educated global citizenry, if we think about how we position our curriculum. And that is where I think taking a look at network analysis might give us a way in that we haven't thought about so far. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.